You're listening to Time's DC Brief newsletter from April 3rd, 2025. This audio was produced by 11 Labs for Time using an AI voice. Our top story is called Congress is Freaking Out About Trump's Trade War, but Not Enough to Stop Him, by Time senior correspondent Philip Elliott. A fast-spreading panic hit Capitol Hill on Thursday, as President Donald Trump's trade war prompted markets to suffer their worst day since the onset of the pandemic in 2020, and analysts were predicting the worst was yet to come. While most Hill Republicans tried to avoid criticizing their party's leader, frustrations were being laid bare as their talking points didn't match those coming out of the White House. Lawmakers were insisting Trump's new tariffs are a starting point for a negotiation, while the White House said they're actually the end of the discussion. Frantic calls to cabinet agencies about home district impacts were yielding platitudes and not promises. Even Give Trump a Chance Republicans began losing patience as their office phone lines were on fire. Trump's stated goal is to force businesses to make their wares on U.S. soil, in theory sparking a renaissance in domestic manufacturing. Economists are highly skeptical, but even Trump's apologists worry that the short-term ramp-up is going to be rough. Midterm elections seldom reward the party holding the White House even in the best of times, and Republicans are quickly realizing that Trump's kitchen table chaos may end up tanking their hopes for retaining control of Congress next year. None of this was thought through, says one Republican lobbyist who is trying to tell her association's members not to panic. The math doesn't work, the endgame doesn't work, the politics doesn't work. This is just a mess, and it is going to cost Republicans seats. Not too long ago, Congress would have had some say in the tariffs levied on other countries. But Trump is calling the trade imbalance between domestic markets and its international partners as a national emergency to avail himself of powers that allow him, without any real check, to impose these tariffs. The result is set to be a minimum 10% tax on most goods coming into the country and climbing to a net 79% charge on some stuff coming in from China. Put plainly, this was not the trade rebalancing Hill Republicans would have drafted had they been consulted. Just don't expect things to move in any meaningful way against Trump's orders anytime soon, no matter how steamed they are. A handful of Republicans were motioning to curb Trump's capricious trade war, but not in a way that anyone in Washington expects will go anywhere. As Time's Nick Popley reports from the Hill, Senator Chuck Grassley, an Iowa Republican whose home state farmers will pay dearly if the export markets close, is backing a measure that requires Congress to approve tariffs within 60 days of a White House announcement. But there is almost zero chance the bill will get sufficient backing, let alone a vote, in the GOP-led House. Grassley's move peeved the White House, but is just that, an annoyance. It's the same fate that awaits a small-scale symbolic version to undo the penalties against Canada that immediately cleared the Senate on Wednesday. For now, the Senate map in 2026 still favors Republicans, with retirements of Democrats in toss-up states like New Hampshire, Michigan, and Minnesota giving GOP strategists optimism about adding to their majorities. But the argument for electing Republicans becomes tougher once clothing and grocery bills spike, and housing starts to plummet because Canadian lumber is too expensive to frame up a new development. This tit-for-tat trade retribution is an impulse that has long been part of Trump's worldview. He thinks the United States is getting ripped off, plain and simple. He sees a deck stacked against American manufacturers, and he has the power to remedy this for what he calls the little guy. It's all guaranteed to be bad politics for a president who returned to office on promises of curbing inflation, driving down costs, and fixing Washington, and his fellow party members who are fine going along. Republicans at the Capitol understand this is going to hurt not just Americans, but their own political futures. It's why, in a low-key fever, they're freaking out. But here's the rub. While they know this is bad for just about everyone, don't expect them to exercise their congressional authority to get Trump to back off. Their prospects may be bad right now, but they view crossing a president who leads a vindictive movement as even worse. This is not a moment where anyone in Washington is expecting political bravery. Far from it. The question many Republicans in the Capitol are asking themselves, which path will yield the least pain for selfish spoils? It's a pretty weak way to run a superpower. Continuing our coverage, Time reporter Rebecca Schneid wrote an article called Why Economists Are Horrified by Trump's Tariff Math. When President Donald Trump initially announced his new tariffs in February, he proposed them as a fair and reciprocal plan on trade. And so it was assumed that these reciprocal tariffs, as they are known, would be equal in value to the taxes that foreign countries have set against U.S. goods. In fact, the tariffs unveiled on Trump's April 2nd quote, Liberation Day, were slightly more complicated, and for some economists, more worrying. Trump first slapped a 10% blanket tariff on all imports into the U.S., including from uninhabited islands, such as the Heard and McDonald Islands, and on places with which the U.S. runs a surplus, such as the U.K. While speaking from the Rose Garden at the White House, Trump said, "To all of the foreign presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, ambassadors, and everyone else who will soon be calling to ask for exemptions from these tariffs, I say, terminate your own tariffs, drop your barriers, don't manipulate your currencies." On top of this baseline 10% charge, Trump held up a cardboard chart and announced additional tariffs for some countries, calculated by tariffs charged to the USA. The Trump administration ended up using a simple calculation: each country's U.S. trade deficit divided by its exports to the U.S. The final reciprocal tariff was then divided by 2, with a minimum of 10%. Before the Trump administration confirmed this method, prominent economist James Surowiecki received attention for reverse engineering the explanation of the tariff pricing on X. Instead, for every country, they just took our trade deficit with that country and divided it by the country's exports to us, the former financial columnist for The New Yorker posted on X. What extraordinary nonsense this is. The Office of the United States Trade Representative confirmed Trump's tariff math in an explainer, stating, "Reciprocal tariffs are calculated as the tariff rate necessary to balance bilateral trade deficits between the U.S. and each of our trading partners." To conceptualize reciprocal tariffs, the tariff rates that would drive bilateral trade deficits to zero were computed. Though the explanation uses Greek letters and formulas, Politico notes that it is essentially the same formula that Surowiecki posted. Using this formula, the Trump administration calculated extremely high rates for certain countries, including a new 34% tariff imposed on China, 46% for Vietnam, and 20% for the European Union. Felix Tintelnot, associate professor of economics at Duke University, sees major problems with this method of calculation, notably that the trade deficit is normal and can change. Let's say the trade deficit in Vietnam shrinks over the next year. Well, then the tariff rate also should change. But now, market participants need to forecast how much the trade deficit with individual countries will change, Tintelnot says. And that's not straightforward, because we are changing so many tariffs at the same time, and ultimately, the aggregate trade deficit of the U.S. is largely determined by other macro decisions, like aggregate savings and aggregate investment, that have nothing to do with tariff rates. He also points out how, for certain countries, it does not matter whether they actually have tariffs on the U.S. Israel eliminated tariffs on U.S. goods on April 1st in preparation for Trump's tariffs, but were still hit hard by a 17% tariff in the April 2nd announcement. Up next, Time reporter Chantel Lee has an exclusive story called "More than 150 House Democrats Urge HHS to Restore Title X Funds." More than 150 House Democrats signed a letter sent to U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on April 3rd, calling for the department to undo the freeze on millions of dollars allocated for family planning services. The letter, shared exclusively with Time, comes after HHS confirmed this week that it is withholding Title X funds from 16 organizations, quote, pending an evaluation of possible violations of federal civil rights laws and President Donald Trump's executive order declaring that undocumented immigrants are barred, quote, from obtaining most taxpayer-funded benefits. Title X is the nation's only federally funded program dedicated solely to family planning, and each year allocates millions of dollars for clinics that provide birth control, cancer screenings, STI testing, and other healthcare services for people from low-income households. HHS did not respond to Time's questions earlier this week about the details of the possible violations, how much money was being withheld from the affected organizations, and which organizations were being hit by the funding freeze. It also did not respond to a further request for comment today, April 3rd. More than $200 million is allocated for Title X annually. On March 25th, the Wall Street Journal reported that HHS was considering freezing $27.5 million of those Title X funds. One of the largest Title X providers, Planned Parenthood, said on March 31st that 9 of its affiliates were informed by the federal government that their Title X funding was being withheld as of April 1st. The letter sent to Kennedy on April 3rd was an effort led by 7 House Democrats: Representative Judy Chu from California, Representative Diana DeGette from Colorado, Representative Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, Representative Teresa Leger Fernandez from New Mexico, Representative Lizzie Fletcher from Texas, Representative Sharice Davids from Kansas, and Representative Nikema Williams from Georgia. The 162 House Democrats who signed it said in the letter that Title X has been, quote, a cornerstone of safety net care for decades. Championed by then Congressman George H.W. Bush and signed into law by President Nixon, Title X allows a diverse network of providers to deliver high-quality care to low-income, uninsured, or underinsured individuals confidentially, the letter said. These centers offer care to populations that often face severe structural and systemic barriers to accessing quality health care, including individuals with no or insufficient insurance and rural and underserved communities. Freezing funds for this essential program will harm communities that otherwise may not have access to care. According to the letter, Title X-funded clinics provided services to 2.8 million people in 2023. In 2016, 60% of the women who received birth control from a clinic participating in the Title X program revealed that that was their only source of health care the year before, according to the letter. The letter also cited a report from the Guttmacher Institute, which researches and supports sexual and reproductive health and rights, that found that every dollar spent on Title X services saves $7 in Medicaid-related expenses. Reproductive rights experts have called the freeze absolutely devastating, saying that Title X allows many people to access critical healthcare services they may not otherwise be able to afford. Experts at the Guttmacher Institute estimated that between 600,000 and 1.25 million people could be affected by the freeze annually. Finally, Time politics reporter Nick Popley writes, "He's going to tank our economy. Trump's tariffs draw strong reactions in Congress." Less than a day after President Donald Trump imposed a wave of new tariffs on dozens of countries, members of Congress from both parties were grappling with what to make of a trade strategy they fear could tank the U.S. economy, drive up consumer prices, and destabilize global markets. Democrats seized on the market reaction to underscore what they see as reckless economic policymaking. "This is uncoordinated, capricious, and simply destructive," Senator Adam Schiff, a California Democrat, told Time Thursday morning. "He's going to tank our economy, and he could tank much of the economy around the world." Those fears were fueling a stronger GOP pushback against Trump than seen in his second term thus far, though those speaking out still represented a minority in their party. Trump's tariffs quickly triggered a significant sell-off in the stock market, with major indexes on track for their worst day since at least 2022. Economists warn that the volatility may only be the beginning, with some predicting prolonged economic uncertainty if the tariffs remain in place and countries retaliate with additional taxes on American goods. 4 Republicans delivered a largely symbolic rebuke to Trump's trade policy just hours after he announced them, voting Wednesday evening to undo his earlier tariffs on imports from Canada. Republican Senators Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine, and Rand Paul of Kentucky voted with all Democrats to invalidate a national emergency that Trump declared in February that allowed him to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. Murkowski told Time on Thursday that she generally supports tariffs as an economic principle, but doesn't support the kind of across-the-board tariffs Trump is imposing. The measure is not expected to move in the House, where House Speaker Mike Johnson defended the tariffs as a necessary measure to restore, quote, fair and reciprocal trade, and level the playing field for American workers. Republican Senator Rick Scott of Florida was similarly bullish on Trump's latest policy and dismissed the stock market reaction. "I don't invest in the market directly. I'm focusing on what I like about tariffs. They're focused on American jobs," he tells Time, adding, "I'm glad we finally have a person that gives a damn about American jobs." However, others in the GOP were less certain. Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson described Trump's strategy as a high-risk bet, while North Carolina Senator Tom Tillis admitted he was waiting to see how the market and trading partners responded before forming a definitive stance. The most significant GOP opposition to the trade policy on Thursday came from Senator Chuck Grassley, a senior Republican lawmaker from Iowa, who introduced a bill with Democratic Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington to curtail the president's authority to impose tariffs without congressional approval. The Trade Review Act of 2025, modeled after the War Powers Act, would require Congress to review and approve tariffs within 60 days or allow them to expire. Grassley emphasized the need to, quote, reassert Congress's constitutional role in setting trade policy and prevent executive overreach. Hours later, Tillis told reporters he would support the bill. Thank you for listening to Time's DC Brief. For more news and politics, visit time.com.